You know, people always say life can change in a heartbeat. But I never really understood that until August of 2025. It was a Thursday morning, hot and muggy outside, when I walked into the office like I had 100 times before. Same cubicles, same hum of the air conditioner, same dull chatter about coffee flavors and traffic jams. Everything felt normal, until it wasn't. I was called into a conference room. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the HR manager sitting there with a stack of papers and that awkward half-smile people give when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear. My boss wouldn't even make eye contact. And then came the words, short, sharp, final, "We're letting you go." I wish I could say I handled it with grace. But the truth is, I froze. My heart pounded like I had just run a marathon. Questions crashed through my mind. Why me? How am I going to pay rent? What do I tell my family? They said something about restructuring, budgets, nothing personal. But when you lose your job, it's always personal. Walking out of that building with a cardboard box of my belongings felt surreal. Just yesterday, I was a valued team member. Today, I was unemployed in a brutal job market, one of thousands trying to figure out what's next. The first few days were the hardest. There's this strange silence when you lose your routine. No morning commute, no emails piling up, no annoying meetings. At first, it feels like freedom, but then it turns into emptiness. I'd wake up, sit at the kitchen table, and just stare at the wall. My thoughts kept circling. How long before savings run out? How long before I can find something else? The August 2025 job market was unforgiving. Companies were cutting back, not hiring. Every application felt like tossing a rock into the ocean, no splash, no echo, just silence. Rejections trickled in. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. After the 10th one, you stop reading the rest of the email. And then there's the part nobody talks about, the way unemployment eats at your identity. Work isn't just a paycheck. It's structure. It's purpose. Without it, I felt like a ghost moving through my own house. I snapped at little things, avoided friends, lied to family about how I was just exploring options. Truth was, I was scared. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when I overheard my neighbors arguing about the HOA. Their voices carried across the street, something about parking rules, late fees, and board members being unfair. Normally, I would have rolled my eyes. Everyone hates their HOA, right? Too many rules, too much drama. But this time, it hit different. Maybe it was the beer in my hand, maybe it was the frustration in my gut, but a thought crept in. What if I actually got involved? I laughed at myself at first. HOA. Really? I had just lost a corporate job, and now I was thinking about volunteering for some neighborhood committee that everyone despised. It sounded ridiculous. But here's the thing, ridiculous ideas have a way of sticking around. That night, I couldn't shake it. I kept replaying the neighbor's frustration in my mind. Parking disputes, fines, rules that didn't make sense, these weren't abstract problems. They were real, everyday issues that made people miserable in their own homes. And for the first time since I lost my job, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks, curiosity. Over the next few days, I found myself digging into HOA forums online. I read horror stories, boards abusing power, residents feeling trapped, lawsuits over the silliest things. But I also found something else, opportunities. Communities that had turned things around with better leadership. Neighbors who made small changes that snowballed into real improvements. And that's when it hit me. Maybe I couldn't fix the corporate world. Maybe I couldn't snap my fingers and land a new job. But maybe, just maybe, I could fix something right here in my own backyard. That thought scared me. It also excited me. Because what if this wasn't just about me being unemployed? What if losing my job was the universe's way of pushing me towards something I never would have considered? The first step was small. I signed up to attend the next HOA meeting. Just a resident, just curious. But inside, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Part of me thought it was stupid, a waste of time. Another part whispered, what if this is where everything changes? And that's how my journey began. From a corporate layoff that knocked me flat, to a ridiculous idea that wouldn't let go. I didn't know it then, but that simple decision, to walk into a meeting about rules and dues, was about to flip my entire life upside down. They say rock bottom is the foundation you build on. At the time, I didn't believe it. To me, rock bottom just felt like rock bottom. After losing my job, the weeks blurred together. Job boards, resumes, cover letters, I treated them like a full-time job, but the only thing I collected was rejection emails. My savings account was shrinking, bills weren't, and every time my phone buzzed, I prayed it was good news. It never was. One afternoon, I stood in the grocery store holding a loaf of bread, staring at the price tag. I realized I was calculating whether I should put it back and get the cheaper brand. That was my breaking point. I had gone from comfortable corporate paychecks to budgeting bread. And in that moment, it hit me, I wasn't just unemployed. I was stripped of dignity. The emotional toll was heavy. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and just stare at the ceiling, my chest tight with anxiety. I stopped answering calls from friends. What was I supposed to say? Yeah, I'm still jobless, still broke, still spiraling. Even family gatherings became uncomfortable, everyone asking, so what's next, as if I had a secret plan tucked away. Inside, I was drowning. And then, as if to rub salt in the wound, a letter came from the HOA, a fine for leaving my trash bins out too long. $50. Normally, I would have grumbled, paid it, and moved on. But this time, I was furious. $50 felt like a punch in the gut. I didn't even have $50 to spare. That fine wasn't just about bins, it was about control. About someone on the other side of a table making decisions that impacted me without a second thought. And I started to see things differently. It wasn't just me, neighbors were frustrated too. Rules didn't make sense. Fees weren't explained. The board felt more like a sheriff's office than a community group. And suddenly, my anger turned into something else, resolve. I went to my first HOA meeting out of spite, honestly. I wanted to see who had the audacity to send that fine. I pictured a bunch of power-hungry neighbors in collared shirts, ready to lecture the rest of us. And in some ways, I was right. The board members sat up front like judges, shuffling papers, talking in jargon most people didn't understand. Residents mumbled complaints. Nothing got solved. But here's what surprised me, nobody seemed to actually want to be there. The board members looked tired, the residents looked defeated, and everyone acted like this was just the way things were. It wasn't malicious, it was apathy. And for some reason, that lit a fire in me. Because I'd been stripped of everything familiar, my job, my identity, my routine, and I was desperate for something to hold on to. Something where I could contribute. Something where my voice mattered. So when the board asked if anyone wanted to volunteer for the architectural committee, my hand shot up before I even thought about it. I still remember the look on their faces, surprise, relief, maybe even pity. But in that moment, I felt alive again. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just the guy who lost his job. I was part of something. That night, I walked home lighter. Did I suddenly have money in the bank? No. Did I land a new job? Not even close. But I had a foothold. A place to put my energy besides endless job applications and self-pity. And funny enough, once I started paying attention, I realized how much power an HOA actually has. It decides what your neighborhood looks like, how much you pay, what you can or can't do on your own property. It shapes your daily life in ways most people don't even notice, until it bites them. I started small. Reviewing fence requests, paint colors, and mailbox replacements. Sounds boring, right? But here's the thing, people cared. That neighbor who wanted a red door. She cared. The guy fixing up his deck. He cared. These weren't just forms, they were pieces of people's homes, their pride, their investments. And as I listened to their frustrations, I started to see patterns. The HOA wasn't evil, it was disconnected. Decisions were being made without listening. Rules were enforced without explanation. And homeowners felt powerless. That hit me hard. Because that's exactly how I felt after losing my job, powerless. But here, in this small corner of the world, I had a chance to flip the script. One night, after a long committee meeting, I sat on my porch again, but this time it was different. Instead of staring at the wall, I scribbled notes on how the board could improve communication. Instead of drowning in anxiety, I was brainstorming solutions. For the first time in months, my brain wasn't focused on failure, it was focused on building. And then it clicked. Maybe this was the reason I hit rock bottom. Because without losing that job, I never would have looked twice at the HOA. Without the frustration, the fines, the emptiness, I never would have seen the opportunity. Rock bottom had pushed me to the bottom of the barrel, yes. But it also pushed me into a space I never would have considered. And that space was about to become the foundation for something bigger than I ever imagined. I didn't know it yet, but those small steps, the anger over a trash bin fine, the decision to show up at a boring meeting, the impulsive hand raise to join a committee, were the seeds of something much larger. Something that would not only reshape my neighborhood, but reshape me. When I first joined the architectural committee, I thought it would just be a distraction, something to keep me busy while I tried to figure out my next career move. What I didn't realize was that this side gig was about to become the center of my life. At first, I stayed quiet. I sat in meetings, listened to the board talk, and watched how things played out. But the more I listened, the more I noticed how inefficient everything was. Requests piled up for weeks, sometimes months. Homeowners felt ignored. And every meeting seemed to end the same way, residents leaving frustrated, and board members shrugging like, "What can you do?" But I had time. I wasn't rushing to another meeting at work, or flying across the country on business trips anymore. For the first time in years, I had the bandwidth to dive deep into something, even if that something was fence approvals and mailbox repairs. So I did. I started calling neighbors directly to follow up on their requests. A 5-minute chat explaining why their paint color was rejected went a long way. People didn't always like the decision, but they appreciated the respect. And soon, word got around that I was the guy who actually listened. That small reputation snowballed. At the next HOA meeting, someone stood up and said, "I just want to thank him for helping me understand the process. Nobody's ever taken the time before." Heads turned toward me. For the first time in a long while, I felt useful. That night, after the meeting, the HOA president pulled me aside. "You ever thought about running for the board?" he asked. I laughed. Out loud. Me? The guy who was eating budget bread at the grocery store not long ago? The guy who joined just to vent about a trash bin fine? The idea seemed ridiculous. But he wasn't joking. "You've got the patience for it," he said. "And trust me, that's half the battle." I didn't say yes right away. Honestly, I doubted myself. My resume was impressive in the corporate world, sure, but this was different. This wasn't about profit margins or quarterly targets, this was about people. And people are messy. But then again, wasn't that exactly what I needed? Something human, something real. The decision haunted me for weeks. Finally, when election season came, I put my name on the ballot. And you know what? I won. Not by a landslide, but by enough. That night, when they announced the results, I shook hands with neighbors who congratulated me. But when I got home and closed the door, I sat in the dark for a long time. Because for the first time since losing my job, I felt like I was building again. Not a career. Not a paycheck. But something that mattered. Of course, joining the board wasn't a fairy tale. Far from it. The first few months were brutal. I learned quickly that HOA politics can be nastier than office politics. People argued over everything: grass height, pool hours, parking spaces. I saw friendships strained, neighbors shouting, even lawsuits threatened. And I'll be honest, there were nights I wanted to quit. But here's the thing, because I'd already hit rock bottom, I wasn't afraid of the struggle. I'd already lost more than most of these people imagined. What's a shouting match compared to losing your identity? What's a complaint email compared to wondering if you can afford groceries? That perspective became my strength. Where others saw petty drama, I saw an opportunity to solve problems. Where others saw angry homeowners, I saw people desperate to be heard. Slowly, I built trust. I created newsletters that explained decisions in plain English. I hosted coffee chats on Saturday mornings where neighbors could vent before it turned into a fight at the next meeting. I even convinced the board to post budgets online for transparency. And little by little, the atmosphere shifted. Meetings were still tense, but people showed up. Residents who had given up started participating again. They didn't always agree, but at least they felt included. One night, after a particularly tough meeting where we resolved a long-standing dispute about parking, a woman I barely knew stopped me in the hallway. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked. "For actually caring. Nobody's ever cared this much before." I went home that night and sat on my porch, the same porch where months earlier I had stared at the wall, hopeless. But now, I felt something entirely different. Pride. Not the hollow pride of climbing a corporate ladder, but the real kind. The kind that comes from serving others. As months turned into a year, I noticed something else happening. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was leading. Neighbors started coming to me before they even brought issues to the board. I was becoming the bridge between frustrated residents and stubborn rules. The guy who could translate HOA language into plain conversation. And then, one day, the president announced he was stepping down. The board needed a new leader. And almost without hesitation, the room looked at me. I was stunned. Me, the guy who started this journey out of anger over a $50 trash bin fine, was being asked to lead the entire association. And in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't just stumbled into this role. I had earned it. Not by resume, not by title, but by listening. By showing up. By caring. When I accepted, the weight hit me. This wasn't a distraction anymore. This wasn't a temporary fix until I found another corporate job. This was real responsibility. Real power to shape a community. I had gone from rock bottom to board president. From invisible to influential. From fired, to leading a neighborhood. And as I stood there, shaking hands, hearing congratulations, I knew, this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of something bigger. Taking on the role of HOA president was like being handed the keys to a machine that everyone hated but everyone relied on. It was clunky, outdated, and barely functioning, but it kept the neighborhood moving. And now, I was the driver. At first, I felt the weight of every decision. I'd wake up at night thinking about budgets, vendor contracts, and lawsuits that had been dragging on for years. But underneath all the stress, there was also excitement. For the first time in a long while, I had the power to make change, not just to fix things temporarily, but to reshape the community. And I was determined not to waste it. The first big challenge came from something as small as playground equipment. Parents had been complaining for years that the swings were rusting, the slide was cracked, and the mulch was so thin that kids were practically landing on concrete. Every board before mine had said the same thing: it's too expensive. I looked at the numbers. Yes, it was expensive. But you know what else was expensive? Lawsuits. And it was only a matter of time before a kid got hurt. So I fought for it. I researched grants, negotiated with vendors, and convinced the board to shift money from projects nobody cared about. 6 months later, we cut the ribbon on a brand new playground. The first time I walked by and saw kids laughing, parents sitting on benches, and neighbors chatting instead of arguing, I knew we'd done more than replace old swings. We'd rebuilt trust. That playground became a turning point. People who used to avoid meetings started showing up. Not to yell, but to share ideas. A retired teacher suggested starting a community book club. A group of dads offered to form a neighborhood watch. Someone even volunteered to plant flowers around the entrance signs. It was like the whole place had been waiting for permission to care again. And now, they had it. But not everyone was happy. HOAs have a reputation for being strict for a reason. There were board members who loved nothing more than sending violation letters. One in particular, let's call him Dan, saw himself as the sheriff of the neighborhood. Grass too tall. Letter. Basketball hoop left out. Letter. Your kid's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Letter. I'll never forget the meeting where he proudly announced he had issued 47 violation letters in 1 month. The room went silent. Parents exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "This is ridiculous." I leaned forward and said, "Dan, we're not running a prison. We're running a community. If people feel attacked, they'll stop listening." He bristled. "Rules are rules." "True," I said. "But rules mean nothing if the community doesn't respect the people enforcing them." It wasn't the last time Dan and I clashed. But little by little, the board shifted. Instead of treating residents like enemies, we started treating them like partners. Instead of slapping fines on every mistake, we tried warnings, conversations, and solutions. And you know what happened? Complaints went down. People complied more willingly. It turns out, when you treat people like adults, they usually act like it. One of my proudest moments came during a heated debate over parking. Our neighborhood was growing, families had more cars, and street parking had become a war zone. The old rule said, no overnight street parking. Period. But enforcing that was impossible, and resentment was boiling over. I called a special meeting, not to dictate, but to listen. For 2 hours, neighbors shared frustrations, solutions, and compromises. By the end of the night, we didn't have a perfect plan, but we had something better, agreement. Together, we created a permit system that actually worked. Walking out of that meeting, a guy patted me on the back and said, "I've lived here 20 years. That's the first time I felt like the board cared what I thought." The man who had once felt worthless after losing his job had found a new purpose. Not in a paycheck, but in people. Not in a career, but in a community. And though I didn't know it yet, this journey was leading me to something even greater. Something beyond board meetings and neighborhood disputes. Something that would redefine who I was, not just for my neighbors, but for myself. When I first joined the HOA, I thought it was just a way to fill the space left by losing my job. I figured I'd keep busy, maybe make a few improvements, and move on when something better came along. But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of the HOA as a placeholder. It had become a turning point. What started as a desperate attempt to stay useful had grown into something bigger than I ever expected, a calling. One evening, after a particularly long meeting about landscaping contracts, I sat in my car before driving home. Normally, I'd be drained. But instead, I felt alive. I realized it wasn't about the mulch, or the contracts, or even the meetings. It was about people. The retired veteran who stopped me on his morning walk just to say thanks for fixing the sidewalks. The teenagers who no longer had to sneak around to play basketball because we'd finally installed new courts. The single mom with the red door who smiled every time she waved to me. These were the moments that filled me in ways my old corporate career never had. And it hit me, maybe this was my purpose all along. But purpose has a funny way of expanding when you embrace it. Word started to spread. Other neighborhoods nearby heard about the changes in our community. At first, it was little things, an email asking how we cut costs without cutting quality, or a call from a neighboring HOA president curious about our parking system. Then, one day, I got invited to speak at a regional HOA workshop. Me, the guy who had once been too embarrassed to admit he was even on the board, was now standing in front of a room full of people, sharing how we turned around our neighborhood. I told them the truth. It's not about rules. It's not about fines. It's about respect, trust, and listening. When people feel heard, they'll care. And when they care, everything changes. The applause that followed wasn't just for the story. It was for the possibility that what we did could be done anywhere. From there, opportunities kept opening. I started writing small articles for community newsletters. I joined online forums where frustrated homeowners vented about their terrible HOAs, and I offered a different perspective. Eventually, a local paper ran a story about our neighborhood, calling it a model for community transformation. People began to see me not just as that HOA guy, but as someone who had found a way to make local leadership meaningful. And with every new conversation, I felt the same spark, that what I had learned through my fall and rebuild wasn't just for me. It was meant to be shared. Of course, not everyone understood. Some old friends from my corporate days would chuckle when I told them about board meetings or community projects. Really? That's what you're doing now, they'd say, as if I'd downgraded my life. But I didn't see it that way anymore. Because here's the truth, I'd climbed the corporate ladder before, and it left me hollow. Now, I was building something with real meaning. And while it might not have come with a corner office or a six-figure salary, it came with something no paycheck had ever given me: connection, fulfillment, and purpose. Then came the moment that truly changed how I saw my future. It was our community's annual holiday party. Kids were running around with hot cocoa, neighbors were singing carols, and the whole clubhouse was glowing with decorations. In the middle of it all, a woman walked up to me with her son. She introduced herself as Sarah, and told me they had moved into the neighborhood 6 months earlier. She said, "We picked this community because we heard it was different. We heard it was alive. And it is. Thank you for making this a place where my son can grow up happy." Her little boy tugged on my sleeve and said, "I love the playground. I don't cry easily." But that night, I had to step outside for a moment, because the weight of what she said hit me hard. I had lost my job. I had lost my confidence. But I had gained something far more valuable, the chance to make a difference. That night, I realized something else: this journey wasn't just about my neighborhood anymore. It was about people everywhere who needed to see that local leadership, whether in an HOA, a PTA, or a small town council, could be more than bureaucracy. It could be a lifeline. So I started dreaming bigger. Writing more. Speaking more. Mentoring others who wanted to step up in their own communities. I began to see myself not as someone who fell into HOA work, but as someone who had been redirected toward a mission. Because sometimes, rock bottom isn't the end. It's the foundation. Looking back now, I see a clear line. Losing my job felt like the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But it pushed me out of a world where my value was tied to a paycheck and into a world where my value was measured by impact. I went from fired to fulfilled. From powerless to purposeful. From a man searching for his identity to a man building it every day, right alongside his neighbors. I became, against all odds, an HOA hero. And here's the part I want anyone listening to remember. You don't have to wait for a title, a promotion, or the perfect opportunity to find meaning. Sometimes, the thing that looks small, or even silly, on the surface can change your life in ways you never imagined. Because purpose isn't found at the top of the ladder. It's found where you decide to plant your feet, roll up your sleeves, and care. For me, it happened in my neighborhood. For you? Well, maybe your community is waiting for its hero too.